The rain tapped gently against the wide nursing home window as Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, her frail hands gripping the paper that trembled between her fingers. The room was sterile, but silent, save for the soft hum of distant machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes against polished floors. She stared at the letter. No, not a letter, but a cruel printout of a text thread never meant for her eyes. It had come accidentally, slipped inside her birthday card from her youngest grandchild, who had likely been too young to understand the weight of what he had unknowingly delivered. The messages stung more deeply than any of the physical pain. Age had brought her. "Mom won't last much longer anyway," one message read, followed by a laughing emoji. Another chimed in, "We should get the house appraised now. It's a seller's market." They weren't just discussing her property. They were dissecting her life, splitting it up like scavengers preparing for a feast. Every word was a dagger, slicing through whatever hope she'd clung to that her children still saw her as their mother. Not as a burden or a fading liability, but as the woman who had raised them with every ounce of love she possessed. The worst part wasn't the property dispute. It was the tone, cold, detached, as if she had already ceased to exist. Eleanor blinked, trying to fight back the burning in her eyes, but the tears came anyway, hot and relentless. The irony was cruel. They rarely visited, rarely called, yet they were already fighting over the house she had built with her late husband, brick by brick, memory by memory. The very place where she had held them as infants, wiped away their childhood tears, and later celebrated their weddings and birthdays. Now, to them, it was nothing more than an asset waiting to be divided. Outside the window, the world carried on indifferently, people walking, cars passing, leaves falling, all oblivious to the silent war raging inside her heart. She tightened, her grip on the paper until her knuckles whitened, feeling both heartbreak and a strange, simmering rage rising beneath the sorrow. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who forgave too easily, who sacrificed too much. But this betrayal, felt different. It wasn't just neglect. It was erasure. As a nurse walked in to check on her, Eleanor quickly folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of her sweater. She forced a weak smile, nodding politely as her vitals were taken. But her mind was elsewhere, spinning, planning. This was her breaking point, but not her end. They thought she was powerless, tucked away, forgotten. They had no idea what quiet strength still pulsed beneath her fragile frame. The vultures had circled. Too soon. The wind outside whispered like an old friend as Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed the weight of memory to pull her back. The house they now fought over was never just a house. It was her life's work. Every beam, every nail, every corner filled with the echoes of sacrifice. She saw herself again, decades younger, standing in that same kitchen as the clock struck. Midnight. Her body exhausted, but her mind refusing to rest. 2 sleeping children upstairs, and her own plate untouched as bills sat stacked beside her like silent judges. When her husband died, the world didn't pause. The condolences came and went like a passing rainstorm, but the responsibilities remained, heavier than ever. She had been left alone with 2 children and a mortgage that seemed impossible. Friends suggested she sell the house, move into something smaller, let go of the burden. But she couldn't. That house was the last piece of him she had. It was where he had painted the nursery walls with his own hands, where they had planted the small oak tree in the front yard that now stood tall, shading the porch. Leaving it would have felt like burying him twice. So she stayed. She fought. She found a job during the day as a secretary at the local clinic and cleaned offices at night when the world was asleep. There were nights when the weight of exhaustion felt like drowning. She would come home, kick off her worn shoes, and sink into the kitchen chair, staring at the empty space across the table where her husband once sat, his gentle voice now only a memory. Many nights she cried there, silently, afraid to wake the children. Her tears would fall into the unpaid bills, her sobs swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator. Despite the fatigue, she never let her children feel it. She woke before dawn to pack their lunches, iron their uniforms, and whisper gentle encouragements into their sleepy ears. She attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every scraped knee and broken heart. She became both mother and father, giving them comfort when they needed strength and discipline when they needed guidance. Every extra shift she took, every dollar she saved, went into the house, repairing the leaky roof, fixing the broken fence, upgrading the aging appliances. Not because she cared for the material things, but because she wanted her children to have stability, a place they could always call home. When Christmas came, she found ways to make it magical, even when money was tight. Handmade decorations, second-hand toys cleaned and wrapped with care, and the smell of fresh cookies filling the air. The children never knew how often she went without new clothes or skipped meals just to make sure there was always enough for them. She became an expert at hiding the struggle, masking every worry with a warm smile and open arms. As they grew older, the sacrifices became routine. She helped them with college applications, co-signed loans, and celebrated every achievement, as if it were her own victory. And when they eventually left to build their own lives, she stood at the front door, waving proudly, tears welling in her eyes, proud that she had raised independent adults, but quietly grieving the empty rooms they left behind. Now, as she sat in the nursing home staring at their callous words, it all replayed with piercing clarity. "I built that house from nothing but grief and grit," she whispered to herself. "They never saw the nights I cried alone in that kitchen." The very foundation they now trampled over with greed had been laid with her broken heart and unyielding resolve, and yet, in their eyes, it was nothing more than square footage and market value. Her fingers traced the edge of the folded paper in her pocket. The bitterness stung sharply, but beneath it, something else stirred, a quiet determination. They had forgotten who she was, but she hadn't. It started with a visit that felt, at first, like a rare kindness. Her son Michael and daughter-in-law. Karen arrived one Sunday afternoon with a stack of papers and forced smiles, assuring her it was nothing serious. Eleanor, grateful for the company, had made tea and set out the old porcelain cups they rarely used, trying to make the moment feel like the family gathering she missed. They sat across from her at the kitchen table, the house warm with the scent of fresh biscuits she had baked that morning, the same way she always had when they were children. Michael leaned forward, his voice coated in false concern. "Mom, we've been worried about you, managing all the bills, the insurance, the taxes. It's too much. We just want to help." Karen nodded, chiming in with practiced sweetness. "You shouldn't have to deal with all these little things. You should be relaxing now, enjoying your time, not stressing over paperwork." Eleanor hesitated, looking at the pile of documents between them. Legal jargon blurred before her eyes. Power of attorney, financial authorization, health proxy. Michael waved his hand dismissively. "It's just paperwork, Mom. It'll make it easier for us to handle everything. We'll take care of the bills, deal with the headaches, so you don't have to." She trusted them. They were her children. The very people she had sacrificed her youth for. She had no reason to believe they would do anything to harm her. Her hands shook slightly as she signed each page, line after line, initial after initial, while Karen kept chatting, distracting her with small talk about the grandkids, about how proud they were of her strength, how lucky they were to have her. Eleanor smiled softly, grateful for the brief illusion of family closeness, never realizing the weight of what she was surrendering with each stroke of the pen. Within a week, everything changed. It began with a scheduled doctor's visit. Michael arrived early that morning, unusually insistent. "Come on, Mom. We've made an appointment with a specialist, just a checkup. Better safe than sorry." She agreed, trusting his judgment. But when they arrived at the facility, it wasn't a clinic. It was a care home, a pristine, state-of-the-art building with gleaming floors and silent halls. Staff members greeted them like expected guests, addressing Eleanor by name. Confused, Eleanor looked at her son, searching his face for answers. Michael offered a soothing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's temporary, Mom. Just while we sort things out. The house needs a little work, some updates. You'll be more comfortable here." Before she could protest, papers were signed. Bags she didn't remember packing were wheeled in, and a nurse was escorting her to a small, impersonal room. The door closed gently behind her, but to Eleanor, it felt like a prison gate. That night, as she sat alone on the unfamiliar bed, dread settled heavily in her chest. She called Michael's phone, no answer. She called again, straight to voicemail. The following morning, as she looked out the small window, she saw a photo posted online by her daughter-in-law. A cheerful snapshot of Michael and Karen standing in front of her house, smiling with a contractor and holding floor plans. The caption read, "Finally starting renovations on our dream home." The pit in Eleanor's stomach twisted painfully. Renovations? Dream home? It wasn't about helping her. It never was. They wanted the house, not the woman who made it. Eleanor's mind raced as the betrayal fully unfolded. They had used her trust as a weapon. The home she had fought for, bled for, cried for, stripped away under the guise of loving concern. The kitchen where she spent sleepless nights baking to bring them comfort was now gutted. The living room, where they had opened Christmas presents, was being repainted. The oak tree her husband planted now shaded strangers. They had reduced her life's work to property lines and resale value. As the days passed in the care home, the reality hardened within her. The phone calls became less frequent. The visits almost stopped entirely. When they did come, it was always the same hollow routine, polite smiles, empty reassurances, and hurried departures. But Eleanor no longer listened to their words. She saw through the performance now, every gesture a calculated move to keep her silent and contained. Sitting by the window one evening, her gaze distant but unbroken, she whispered to herself, "They wanted the home, not the woman who made it." But they had underestimated her. They believed they had won. They had no idea what storm they had just awakened. The days blended together like watercolor bleeding across cheap paper, pale, indefinite, forgettable. Eleanor would sit by the window each morning, watching the world outside the nursing home, like a distant movie she no longer belonged to. The first few days after she was placed here, she had waited by the phone, expecting Michael or Karen to call and check in, to reassure her that this was temporary, that the house was safe, that they still cared. But as the hours passed, as the calendar days quietly flipped, the silence became deafening. Her first phone calls went unanswered. She tried Michael first, his voicemail always the same. "Hey, you know what to do." She would leave messages, her voice trembling but polite, asking him to call back when he had time. Then Karen, who never picked up. She called the house, but it always went to an automated system. Each attempt chipped away at her hope, but still she called, certain that surely one of them would respond. They never did. When her birthday arrived, she told herself they were probably planning a surprise. Maybe they wanted to make it special and would walk through the door any moment with balloons and cake like they had when they were children, their little faces beaming as they sang off-key. She dressed herself that morning, carefully choosing the floral blouse Michael had once complimented. She even put on a light touch of lipstick, her hands shaking but determined. She sat in the common room for hours, eyes darting toward every opening door. The staff wished her a happy birthday and brought her a small slice of cake with a single candle. They sang gently, their voices kind but filled with pity. The clock ticked on. The door never opened. By evening, the truth settled heavily into her bones. They weren't coming. No calls, no cards, no flowers, no visits. Her children had erased her from their lives as easily as they had removed her from her home. Eleanor blew out the candle alone, her face expressionless, but her heart quietly breaking anew. The staff at the nursing home began to know her better than her own family. It was the young nurse, Marcy, who sat with her during lunch, listening to Eleanor talk about the oak tree her husband had planted, about Michael's spelling bee championship in 3rd grade, about the quilt she sewed for Karen as a wedding gift. Marcy would smile and listen patiently, gently placing a hand on Eleanor's frail arm as she spoke. The staff remembered her favorite tea, that she liked the window open at night, and that she hummed old songs softly when she was nervous. Strangers now knew the details her children had forgotten, or perhaps never bothered to learn. When the medications changed, it was the nurses who noticed her discomfort. When she had nightmares, it was the night attendant who comforted her. The staff filled the space her children had abandoned, not because they were obligated to, but because they saw the person her family no longer did. Her once vibrant existence shrank to a schedule of pills, meals, and doctor appointments. The home held a quiet sadness, filled with others like her, forgotten, tucked away neatly out of sight so their families could carry on unburdened. Conversations at dinner often circled around visitors who never came, children who were always too busy, promises of visits pushed to an undefined future. They all wore the same thin smiles, pretending it didn't hurt as much as it did. Eleanor kept calling, even when hope had turned brittle. She'd listen to the endless ringing, the hollow voicemail prompts, sometimes whispering to herself before hanging up, maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow brought only more silence. The months stretched on, her voice growing weaker with each unanswered attempt. The people she had built her life around had vanished, not in death, but in deliberate absence. The isolation was not loud or dramatic. It was a slow erosion, a quiet kind of abandonment that left no bruises, only invisible cracks in her spirit. Yet beneath the grief, something else began to stir again. That quiet ember of defiance, the same resilience that had carried her through the years after her husband's death. They had turned their backs on her, but they would not define her ending. The rain was gentle that afternoon, tapping a quiet rhythm against the window as Eleanor sat with a small box of her personal belongings that the staff had finally brought over from the house. It was a modest cardboard container, nothing much. Some photo albums, old letters, a few trinkets that once adorned her bedroom shelves. As her frail fingers sifted through the contents, each item carried the weight of forgotten years. There was a faded photograph of her wedding day, her husband's strong arm around her, both of them full of dreams and untested hope. She paused, running her thumb across his face. She missed him more in that moment than she had in years. Underneath the stack of photos was her worn recipe box, chipped at the corners, the paint slightly peeled, but still intact. The box smelled faintly of vanilla and old paper, as if holding onto the scents of countless baked goods made for birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday mornings. She smiled softly, recalling the countless times she'd opened it to pull out the familiar index cards. Her husband's favorite cornbread, Michael's birthday brownies, Karen's treasured lemon pound cake. Eleanor lifted the lid, not really, knowing why. Perhaps for comfort, perhaps to feel some piece of the life that had been stripped away. The neatly stacked recipe cards greeted her like old friends, their ink faded but legible. But beneath the last divider, tucked flat against the bottom where no one would think to look, was something unexpected. An envelope. Her breath caught as she carefully pulled it out. The paper was yellowed, the edges fragile, but the bold print was still clear. Property deed, full title ownership. Her heart began to pound. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar lines. There, in unmistakable ink, was her name. Only her name. A wave of realization crashed through her. She had forgotten. She had never added their names. Even after years of pressure and suggestions, she always said, "Not yet. There's no rush." And they, perhaps assuming time would take care of everything, never pushed harder. In their arrogance, they assumed control after manipulating her into signing those documents, but none of it had transferred legal ownership. Power of attorney gave them access, but not possession. The house still legally belonged to her. She sat frozen for several minutes, absorbing the enormity of what she had found. The weight of months of despair and helplessness lifted slightly, replaced by a quiet, simmering sense of power. They had taken so much, but they had been sloppy. They had forgotten who she was. They underestimated the woman who had once worked 2 jobs while raising 2 children alone, who had built that house brick by brick with her husband's memory etched into every corner. Eleanor chuckled softly, a dry, bitter laugh escaping her lips. They forgot I kept the original deed tucked in my recipe box, right under the lemon pound cake. She could almost hear her husband's voice, warm and steady, telling her how smart she was for always keeping the important papers safe. Back. Then they didn't have much, but they had each other and a stubborn instinct to protect what was theirs. The deed was her last weapon, her final piece of leverage. They thought they had stripped her of everything, but they had been blinded by their own greed, too distracted to ensure the job was truly finished. She wasn't powerless. Not yet. As the rain continued its soft percussion against the glass, Eleanor's mind began to race with possibilities. She could contact an attorney, someone independent. She still had friends, acquaintances who owed her small favors, people who remembered the woman she was before her children began rewriting her story. This piece of paper changed everything. For the first time in months, she felt the fog of helplessness begin to lift. The isolation, the betrayal, the months of silence, they all fueled the fire now building steadily inside her chest. They thought they had buried her. But she was still breathing. And now she had something they didn't expect: control. Eleanor sat at the small desk in her room, the deed laid out before her like a lifeline. For several nights, she had hardly slept, the wheels in her mind spinning with quiet determination. The staff had noticed the change, her posture a bit straighter, her gaze sharper. She moved like a woman with a purpose again. The helplessness had receded, replaced with a calm, methodical resolve. They expected me to die quietly, she thought, but they underestimated how many years I spent holding this family together with nothing but sheer will. Her first call was to Margaret. It had been years since they last spoke, but Eleanor still remembered the long nights when Margaret sat at her kitchen table, sobbing over legal troubles her own children had caused. Back then, Eleanor had offered her comfort, food, and a place to stay. Margaret never forgot. When Eleanor's name lit up on her caller ID, Margaret answered on the first ring. "Ellie? My God, it's been so long." "Are you all right?" Eleanor's voice was steady. "I'm fine, Margaret, but I need your help." There was a long pause, but Margaret's reply came with quiet conviction. "Whatever you need." Margaret had become a respected estate attorney over the years, specializing in exactly the kind of mess Eleanor now faced. The 2 women met privately at the care home under the guise of an old friend visiting for tea. No one suspected a thing. They spoke softly, but the conversation was sharp, focused, and filled with the kind of clarity only women who had survived too much could share. Margaret reviewed the deed, the power of attorney documents, and the current situation. "They got greedy, Ellie. They never secured legal ownership. They've been operating on assumption and manipulation. You still have full control." Eleanor nodded, her hands steady as she poured them both tea. "Good. Then let's begin." Within days, quiet but decisive moves were set into motion. The first step was revoking the power of attorney. Margaret drafted the necessary documents, filed them with the proper authorities, and notified the care home administration. Her children's legal access to her accounts and decisions was severed, effective immediately. The next move was even bolder. Eleanor authorized Margaret to list the house for sale, not as a family home, but as a private transaction under her sole authority. The listing went up quietly, discreetly. No for sale signs planted in the yard that might tip off Michael or Karen too soon. The agents involved were carefully chosen, sworn to confidentiality. Offers began to arrive within days. The market was, as her son had so casually noted before, quite favorable. Every detail was meticulously handled. Margaret helped Eleanor establish a trust, one that redirected every cent from the property. Sale into accounts designed to benefit causes Eleanor cared about: local women's shelters, scholarships for single mothers, and small community charities that had once helped her keep food on the table. Not a penny would go to her children. Sitting across from Margaret as they finalized the paperwork, Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles. They expected me to die quietly. I chose paperwork over protest, ink over screams, Margaret chuckled softly. I've seen a lot of estate battles, Ellie, but I've never seen anyone handle betrayal with such precision. Eleanor's eyes sparkled, but her voice remained calm. I spent my whole life solving problems without raising my voice. They forgot that. The process continued like a silent symphony of revenge. The nursing home staff remained blissfully unaware of the war unfolding behind Eleanor's polite smile. The calls from Michael and Karen remained absent as they continued to assume she was securely tucked away, no longer a concern. Meanwhile, their inheritance slipped quietly through their fingers, piece by piece, signature by signature. When the house finally sold, Margaret handled the closing documents with surgical efficiency. The funds were transferred into the trust, secured and shielded from any future claims. Eleanor signed the final paperwork with steady hands, feeling the invisible chains her children had wrapped around her snap one by one. As she sat by her window that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. She didn't need confrontation or harsh words. She didn't need dramatic scenes or bitter arguments. She had chosen a quieter path, one paved with legal precision and cold ink. Her children would learn of her actions soon enough. But for now, she simply closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her work done, her dignity intact. The sale moved swiftly, like a storm that her children never saw brewing. The house, her house, sold to a young couple who fell in love with the old oak tree and the history woven into its walls. They admired the craftsmanship, the care that had gone into maintaining it all these years. Eleanor met them briefly through a private video call arranged by Margaret. They smiled warmly, unaware of the storm that raged silently around the property's past. For Eleanor, it was enough to know that the home she built from grief and love would finally belong to people who saw it as a home, not a prize to be carved up and divided. When the sale closed, the funds were transferred exactly as planned. The EDA trust that Margaret helped her create became the lifeboat not for her children, but for others like her. Women and men abandoned, manipulated, and discarded by the very people they had raised. The charity she chose worked tirelessly to support victims of elder abuse, providing legal aid, safe housing, and counseling to those who had nowhere else to turn. Eleanor found comfort in knowing that her pain would become someone else's rescue. Michael and Karen remained blissfully ignorant until the moment they weren't. It was a Saturday afternoon when they arrived at the house, as if it still belonged to them. Michael's SUV pulled into the driveway confidently, the tires crunching over the gravel he once promised to replace, but never did. Karen followed behind, her sunglasses perched atop her head, scanning the front yard, already imagining the renovations that would never happen. But something was wrong. The locks had been changed. Michael tried his key twice before pulling out his phone, irritation flashing across his face. "It's jammed," he muttered. Karen frowned. Did you tell the contractor to change the locks already? I didn't. Authorize anything, he said, his voice rising slightly. They walked around the property, peering through windows, only to see unfamiliar furniture, fresh paint, new fixtures. A stranger's life had already begun, where theirs had never been invited. The young couple, now rightful owners, stepped out onto the porch holding hands. There was no malice in their faces, only confusion. Can I help you? The man asked. Politely, Michael stammered, his face flushing. This is my mother's house. The woman shook her head gently. I'm sorry. We purchased this property last month. Everything's finalized. You'll need to contact your lawyer if you have. Any questions? Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. The realization landed like a hammer to the chest. It was gone. All of it. Desperation quickly turned into fury. Michael tried calling Eleanor's number, but it rang through to the nursing home front desk, where his messages had long been filtered and redirected as part of Eleanor's new legal protections. No more direct access, no more manipulation. Back at the nursing home, Eleanor sat by her window with a cup of tea, her posture as calm as ever. Marcy, the young nurse, entered with a small smile. They called again, she said softly. I took a message like you asked. Eleanor nodded. Thank you, dear. I'm sure they'll figure out the truth soon enough. The news of the sale and the trust followed shortly after. Margaret made sure the legal notifications reached Michael and Karen by certified mail. Their confusion quickly spiraled into rage when they realized not only had the house been sold, but the proceeds were entirely out of their reach. The carefully structured trust left them no loopholes, no appeals. Their access had evaporated completely. They stood on that porch, helpless for the first time, with nowhere to go and no one left to manipulate. All their careful schemes had unraveled into nothing. Eleanor didn't need to see their faces to know what they looked like. Shock, disbelief, a desperation fueled by entitlement finally met with cold consequence. She had lived her life sacrificing, giving, bending, but not anymore. This time she had taken everything back, not with rage or raised voices, but with quiet strategy and careful ink. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing the warmth of satisfaction to fill her chest. Her life, once stolen piece by piece, was hers again. And with that, she finally found peace. The storm that followed was louder than anything Eleanor had expected, but it was far too late. The moment the certified letters landed in Michael and Karen's mailbox, their world cracked. The phone calls began almost instantly, first as angry demands, then as panicked pleas. But Eleanor didn't hear them. She never would. The front desk at the nursing home intercepted each call as arranged. The nurses, knowing exactly how much Eleanor had endured, handled every desperate message, with polite professionalism before placing the notes in a file Eleanor never opened. They called the nursing home, but I had already moved on. And up. Eleanor now sat in her new assisted living apartment, not the sterile, whitewashed room they had tucked her away in before, but a warm, sunlit space she had selected herself. The walls were painted in soft pastels, and potted plants lined the wide windowsills. There was a balcony that overlooked a quiet park, where she often sipped her tea and listened to the distant sound of children playing. She had chosen this place carefully, not too big, not too small, a space where she could live, not simply exist. From here she watched as the remnants of her children's schemes disintegrated. Margaret occasionally updated her with brief summaries. Karen and Michael had tried to contest the sale, but the paperwork was airtight. The trust was irrevocable. There was nothing left to claw back. Their debts, which they had foolishly stacked high while counting on the house's value, now loomed over them like storm clouds ready to burst. The remodelers they had hired sued them for breach of contract when payments stopped. Creditors circled. Lawsuits followed. Karen's carefully curated social media presence, once filled with polished photos of staged home tours and faux charity work, grew quiet, then vanished. Michael's job, once secure thanks to the financial padding he assumed, became unstable. His mortgage payments began to slip. Their friends, once eager to bask in their projected success, drifted away as whispers of their financial collapse spread. The vultures they had once become now circled above them. Still, they called, always calling. Voicemails grew increasingly frantic. Karen's voice cracked with forced sweetness at first. "Mom, please, this has been a huge misunderstanding. Let's sit down. Let's talk. We love you. We've always loved you." Then came Michael's gritted, angry voice. "You can't do this to your own family. You owe us. We took care of you." And finally, the voicemail softened into pitiful apologies. "Please, Mom. We're sorry. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Just call us back, please." Eleanor listened to none of it. She no longer needed to. They had made their choices. She had made hers. In her quiet apartment, she built a small, new life. She joined the weekly book club and began attending watercolor painting classes. Marcy still visited on weekends, bringing homemade muffins and warm conversation. Eleanor laughed more now than she had in years. She no longer lived in a house haunted by betrayal, but in a home filled with peace of her own making. Her dignity was no longer something to be fought for. It was restored, not by her children's remorse, but by her own hand, her own quiet war fought with documents and signatures rather than arguments and begging. She had always known how to survive, but now, for the first time in a long time, she was learning how to simply live. On warm afternoons, she would sit on the balcony with her tea, watching the breeze rustle the trees below, feeling the sun on her face. Occasionally, the phone in her apartment would blink with a new message. She never felt the urge to answer. Their voices, once the center of her world, were now no more than echoes fading into silence. Eleanor had moved on. And up. She was no longer the woman trapped in a nursing home against her will. She was no longer the mother manipulated by children who had forgotten who raised them. She was herself again, calm, steady, and unshaken. And as the world outside spun in its endless chaos, Eleanor simply smiled, sipped her tea, and let it all pass by. The days settled into a calm rhythm Eleanor hadn't known in years. Each morning began with quiet simplicity, a gentle sunrise pouring soft light into her apartment, the hum of the city below distant and comforting rather than overwhelming. She brewed her tea, not rushed or distracted, but present. This was her time now, unclaimed, unhurried, completely hers. As the weeks passed, the weight that had once pulled at her chest began to lift, replaced not by bitterness, but by a strange, soothing clarity. The anger, once sharp and burning, softened into something smaller, quieter. She had carried their betrayal long enough. Now she was ready to set it down. Not for them, for herself. Joining the reading club had been Marcy's idea. "You'll love it," she had said with a grin. "A room full of strong women and plenty of tea." And she was right. The group met twice a week in a cozy corner of the community center where worn armchairs circled beneath warm lamps and shelves overflowed. With donated novels, the women there carried stories like hers. They didn't need to explain the long silences from children who never called, the sting of holidays spent alone, or the ache of being needed only when convenient. Their conversations drifted easily between book plots and shared experiences, small. Confessions wrapped in gentle laughter, moments of pain lightened by the comfort of those who understood without judgment. One afternoon, as they discussed the ending of a novel about a woman reclaiming her life after betrayal, Eleanor found herself speaking words she hadn't planned, her voice calm, steady. "I wasn't a burden," she said softly, her eyes distant. "I was just inconvenient to people who never deserved me." The women nodded, understanding flashing in their eyes. No pity, just recognition. It was a sentence that had lived inside her for months, years even, waiting for release. And now, having said it aloud, she felt its power loosen something inside. Her, like a knot finally untied. Her days filled with new rituals. She walked the gardens each afternoon, savoring the fresh air and the colors of the changing seasons. She tried watercolor painting, something she never had time for before, and found a quiet joy in blending soft blues and greens across the page. She shared meals with her new friends, conversations full of lightness and honesty, absent of the barbed obligations that had once defined her relationships with Michael and Karen. Sometimes, when she paused to reflect, she was struck by how deeply she had once believed her value was tied to her children's approval. For years, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every decision had been made with their futures in mind. And yet, when the time came, they saw her not as the foundation that had carried them, but as an obstacle to be maneuvered. But now, standing on the other side of their betrayal, she saw it differently. Her worth had never truly been in their hands. It had always been in her own, the hands that held them as babies, that cooked their meals, that paid their bills, that signed the documents that ultimately reclaimed her life. She was not diminished by their rejection. If anything, she was finally free of the weight of constantly trying to prove herself worthy of their love. Occasionally, her thoughts wandered to Michael and Karen, not with anger, but with distance. They had chosen who they wanted to be, and she had chosen who she would become in response. Their absence was no longer an ache, but a relief, like a heavy coat shrugged off after too many years. In this newfound peace, Eleanor discovered the parts of herself that had long been buried beneath duty and sacrifice. She was not a victim. She was not defeated. She was not someone to be pitied. She was simply a woman who had survived and who had finally allowed herself to live. As another evening, settled, Eleanor sat on her balcony with a cup of chamomile tea, the soft murmur of distant laughter rising from the courtyard below. The stars blinked gently overhead, steady and ancient, unconcerned with the small dramas of human lives. She breathed in the cool air, feeling its crispness fill her lungs. "I'm all right," she whispered into the night, and for the first time, in a very long time, she truly meant it. The evening light poured softly into her apartment, casting a golden hue over the small dining table set by the window. Eleanor moved through her kitchen with quiet purpose, the familiar rhythm of cooking filling the space with warmth. The scent of roasted chicken and herbs wafted through the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of baked bread cooling on the counter. It was a meal she had made countless times before, but tonight it carried a weight all its own. She reached into the cabinet and pulled down her favorite plate, the one with the delicate blue floral trim her husband had given her on their 10th anniversary. The silverware gleamed under the light as she set the table with careful precision. One plate, one glass. No empty seats filled with absence. No waiting for voices that never came. Only herself, exactly as she wanted it. As she poured a glass of wine, the liquid swirling gently in the crystal, she allowed herself a small smile. This was her home, her choice, a place no one could take from her. The old house, the betrayal, the painful silence, they were all behind her now, like a long, bitter storm that had finally passed. What remained was peace, earned and owned. She sat down, her posture graceful, steady. The food was simple but perfect, prepared just for her. She raised the glass slightly, offering a private toast to the woman who had endured everything and still found her way back to herself. I laid one plate, poured one glass, and toasted to myself, the woman who lived long enough to reclaim her life. There was no loneliness here, only freedom. The silence was no longer heavy. It was light, filled with the gentle hum of a life fully hers. She thought back to the cold days in the nursing home, the hopeless hours spent waiting for calls that never came, and how small she had once felt beneath the weight of their betrayal. But now, she understood. They never saw her strength because they never truly looked. She had always been enough. Outside, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, the world moving on as it always did. The voices of her neighbors drifted through, the walls soft and comforting, reminding her she was no longer trapped in someone else's version of her life. She had built this new chapter with the same resilience that had carried her through every dark corner before. Only this time, she had no one to carry but herself, and that was more than enough. Her phone rested on the nearby table, silent. There were no new messages. Michael and Karen had long since stopped calling, their desperation exhausted, their anger defeated by the impenetrable wall of legal finality she had constructed. Their absence no longer mattered. They had made their choices, and so had she. The clock chimed softly in the background as she finished her meal, savoring every bite not as a reward, but as a simple joy, a joy she had earned. As she cleared the table, rinsing the dishes under warm water, she glanced once more at the quiet apartment bathed in evening glow. She had chosen this place, this life, and no one could take it from her again. There was no audience, no confrontation, no need for explanations. Only peace. And as she turned off the kitchen light and made her way to her armchair by the window, she whispered to herself with calm certainty, "This time, I ate at my table, alone and free." If there had been a voiceover to narrate her story, perhaps it would have spoken softly, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. They say family is everything, but sometimes you've got to choose yourself, especially when they never did. Eleanor closed her eyes, her heart light, her soul finally unburdened. And for the first time in a lifetime, she slept deeply, without dreams of what once was, only peace for what now is.